When we start to wonder about the reality of where we live, we will see that this has been the source of great wonder by many great explorers and cartographers of our past. We'll see that many of these explorers have gone to great lengths to find the ends of the earth. Many of these explorers and cartographers have created many maps along the way to describe the geography and land that they encountered on their journey. When we also look at the philosophy of Zeticism, we can see that map making is one of the greatest aspects of reality that we can apply this philosophy to. Zeticism is a form of scientific inquiry which involves forming a question and then using experiments and observations to find the answers to this question. When we go back to the 1500s and 1700s, we can find maps from cartographers such as Philip Bausch, Gerard D. Jode, and Johann Johannessus that have historical depictions of Antarctica showing it being a much wider continent than what we commonly see on current globe maps today. You can also notice this difference of size of Antarctica on maps from the 1950s. We also notice that this wider shape, size, and orientation of Antarctica has an uncanny resemblance and very similar match in geography to what I'm referring to as the zetetic map of the world. We also find that there is much evidence and data that corroborates this alleged size of Antarctica, which begs the question that all maps are not created equal. And to find this map that closest represents the true geography and nature of our reality, we must do extensive research to find these answers. And after many months of digging into this research, you'll find that there is an overwhelming amount of evidence that supports this zetetic map of the world. As we can see here, this is the zetetic map of the world. One of the first things that you'll notice is obviously Antarctica is a separate continent at the bottom of the map. Now, there is much evidence supporting this from the likes of older maps from the 1500s and 1700s, as well as different data from flight logs to the east coast and the west coast of Antarctica. As far as other data, we have different survey information. We're going to get into a lot of the data that shows that this continent of Antarctica is much wider than we've been told. But this is what the basic map, which I believe is the true geography and nature of our reality. And once we start actually looking into this, as I've looked into for the last several months, we're going to find that there is an overwhelming amount of evidence that all corroborates this map. And some of it's even objective evidence that shows, that proves that Antarctica is a greater distance across than what we've been told on the typical globe maps that show Antarctica at the bottom of a globe. Now, one of the first things I looked at with the shape of Antarctica is I triangulated the distance from the three main gateway cities, which are the three main entry points to Antarctica, and they go to the east and west coast, to the South Pole. And based off of this data and this mileage, I could kind of gauge what the distance was from these southern continents relative to the southern continents. And then from there, I was able to get data from this flight log from 1987 that this is some pretty astonishing, mind-boggling evidence, because this actually objectively proves that Antarctica is far greater in distance across on just this small section of the East Coast. It actually, not only that, but it falsifies Google Earth, and technically it debunks even the globe model, because it proves that Antarctica is much wider across than what we've been told. And that's just one flight log. Also came across on the other coast, the other side of Antarctica, the eastern side, a flight from Africa to the other coast of Antarctica, to Wolfgang Runway and Novo Station, that basically proves, if not highly gives you pretty strong evidence that highly suggests that it's much wider, like thousands of miles wider on just the east coast of Antarctica also. So you have evidence from both coasts with flight logs that show that it's much wider than we've been told. I also discovered some old historical documents that show the kind of the true magnitude and distances of a lot of these southern continents relative to each other, particularly different shipping routes from Australia to Africa and Africa to Australia, and a lot of this gives a lot of very fascinating evidence of these distances that basically differ from the evidence we're told of these southern continents. And I also looked at some other historical books, um, multiple different books from the 1800s that all corroborate this evidence of these distances being quite a bit further than we're told. And this, we're going to see how this all lines up with the distance relative to Antarctica. And there's also evidence I came across from some survey information of the coastline of Antarctica that also proves that Antarctica is much larger than we're told. Now, I'm not going to say it's to the extent of the Gleason's map, but it basically all this data from these flight logs and these old historical documents and these surveys, it all pretty much perfectly corroborates with the distance being, a couple thousand, 2 to 3,000 miles wider across the width from east to west of Antarctica. It's a much more narrower, not narrow, but wider on the east and west than it is from north to south. And a lot of this evidence is going to, some of its objective evidence will prove that that is actually the case. So we're going to get into all this evidence in more detail shortly, but I just wanted to give that kind of tell you what this video is mainly going to show is a lot of the evidence that proves that Antarctica is much wider than we're told. There's also, I did a lot of the research on these expeditions, and there's some newer ones and older expeditions that mathematically prove that Antarctica is much wider than we're told across from east to west. And it's statistically impossible when you actually look at the distance over time math on these expeditions for Antarctica to be the size we're told. And these are some maps from Gerard D. Jode, Johannesson, and Philip Bausch from the 1500s and 1700s. That obviously they all show Antarctica being much wider. And here's actually maps from the National Geographic magazine from the 1950s. All these old maps and even kind of somewhat newer maps show Antarctica as a much wider continent. I'm also going to go over evidence showing how the 24-hour sun works almost perfectly on this model. And it actually, I believe it actually works even more accurately on this zetetic map than the actual Gleason's map. There's evidence suggesting that it can work on the Gleason's map, but when we look, if you actually watch where his finger's pointing here on that spotlight, it's got a smaller orbital path on the reflection, and on the southern reflection, which matches up almost identical to what you would expect to see if Antarctica was a separate continent at the bottom of the map. And even you can see here with this physical demonstration, you can see if you look at the top of the mirror, you'll notice it's got a smaller localized mirrored reflection here at the top, which again, this is exactly what you would see here if Antarctica was a smaller continent. And we also have CAD drawings showing that that this is exactly what you'd see with your personal atmospheric dome vision, your azimuthal grid of vision. So we've done all the CAD work, we've done physical demonstrations of how exactly this would work on the flat model, and it actually works almost perfectly on the zetetic map. So we're going to get more into the 24-hour sun a little bit later, but there's a lot to cover on this. But before we get into all the information and the data, I first want to go over what all of these flat Earth maps are showing that we've been presented, and let's see if that's actually matches up to our observable reality and if it actually lines up with the rest of the evidence we've been told. One of the biggest points of contention with the flat Earth topic is the flat Earth maps, and this goes for both sides, both the globe and flat side have a lot of disagreements with different scalings and disproportionate land sizes and scales. And when we look at all the maps, to get the best idea of what would most accurately represent reality, we can kind of break it down into four groups. We can see the Gleason map, you can see the Air Force, the old Air Force maps, the moon map, and then kind of the boilerplate AE maps. Now, the one thing that all four of these have in common is they all depict Antarctica as a ice ring that is surrounding the continent. Now, normally you'll get that when you project a azimuthal equidistant map centered on the North Pole. That's always going to happen. Now, this is the common recurring theme. Now, remember this because it's going to come up again later. It's very important. I'm going to bring this this ice ring thing back up again with these maps. But for now we're going to focus on the Gleason map. Now, obviously, the Gleason map has its share of discrepancies. There's issues with the scale, disproportionate land sizes. There's a lot of things that don't quite add up on it. And remember, this is a longitude and time calculator, so it doesn't work really for navigation. You can't take a point-to-point measurement on it. It doesn't really work like that. It's a longitude and time calculator. So that's one of the reasons why you have so much distortion and the scaling doesn't always match up. Now, one of the biggest things that don't work on this Gleason map is Antarctica expeditions. And there's been dozens of them from the east to the west coast and also north to south. And they just simply do not work. They're actually basically impossible on the Gleason map. Now we can see here, this is the layout of the base stations in Antarctica by their longitude and latitude coordinates. So we can kind of reference these with some of these expeditions. For example, we can look at the Mike Horn expedition, which started up by Novo Station, then navigated down to the South Pole, and then from there he would have navigated up to Dumont D'Urville base station, which is about 3,000 miles away from New Zealand. And then from there he actually sailed his boat. It was, I think, a week or a week and a half trip up to Hobart. But you can see on this map, just from the distance he's traveling, this is like close to 30,000 miles because he started on the east side. So remember, he started on the east of South America, and he did this on foot. He snow kited for, I mean, he wasn't walking, but he snow kited. But it took him 57 days to get from this side of South America all the way to the other side over by Australia. Now that's almost 30,000 miles. That's humanly impossible. And that just does not work on the Gleason's map because you're not going to be able to walk that distance or even see that distance. It would take you, years to do that kind of distance, and you probably wouldn't be able to do it. And you'll notice these discrepancies get worse the more that you look in these expeditions. And these expeditions, there's dozens of them. People do them every year. And you can even take some of these shorter ones like Colonel Brady, who started up here by Berkner Island, and he just went down to the South Pole. This one is actually Will Steger. He went from the peninsula down to the South Pole and all the way back up to Murney Station. Now that's, most people believe that this is the circumference of this ice perimeter is about 50 to 60,000 miles. So he's roughly doing half of that. So he's doing a little over 30,000 miles to do this. And he did this in 210 days, but they were on like dog sleds, and they weren't really going, they were maybe navigating 30 miles a day. So that's just not going to work. You're not going to be able to do over 30,000 miles in that time frame. And even with these shorter ones, like I was saying earlier, they're going from the east side of South America and they're ending up here by 3,000 miles away from New Zealand by Myrtle Station, their pickup point, and that's taken them, 70 to 100 days. Now you can say that these are faked, But the problem with that is that they're tracking these on GPS. This is the Mike Horn route that he tracked on his Iridium satellite phone. So this is obviously tracking his location in Antarctica. He's also taking photographs while he's at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. And this is him at the end of the expedition at Dumont Dervise Station. This is over by, about 2,800 miles away from New Zealand, closer to 3,000 miles. And then he also tracked his progress. He'd made daily logs of where he was at in Antarctica, on his, social media, on his Facebook and his Instagram. And here's another one: is Colin Brady. He took photos while he was at the geographic South Pole, and the distance that he would have navigated on the Gleason map would have been about 25,000 miles, but he did it in like 50 days. Now here's another one. This one's actually going on right now. This is Akshay Nanavati. He's obviously, you can see his route here. He would be starting on the east side of South America up by Berkner Island, and he'd end up all the way up by McMurdo Station by the time he's done, which again is about 25,000 miles. And he's doing this in about a little over 100 days. Now he's also got a live GPS tracker. Now this is the same one that with the Iridium satellite phones that Jaron and Austin are going to be using during the final experiment. And obviously it's tracking him in Antarctica. So to say it's fake, there's enough evidence there, documentation, there's GPS, there's photos, there's updates on the live stream. They're physically in Antarctica. They got photos of them on the east side of South America. They're going to the South Pole, taking a photo there, and then they're taking a photo when they leave up by New Zealand here. So, on this Gleason map, you would have to start way over here, and you'd end up way over here in a matter of 70 to 100 days, sometimes less. And that's just not possible. So that, to me, was always one of the biggest things that it falsified this whole map. And it also, to me, what it really implicated for me was that in order for that to happen, Antarctica, the only way that this would be possible would be Antarctica would have to be a separate, isolated continent, just like the other 6 continents. And you would still have an ice barrier around the outside. But Antarctica, the only way this could work, with dozens of people making these expeditions, every year, you would have to have Antarctica as a separate continent. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be the exact size we're told, and that's the evidence I'm going to get into. And we're going to obviously show you that objectively it's not the size we're told. It's quite a bit wider and greater in distance than what we're told. But we're going to get into that later. However, I'm going to go back to the maps that are representing Antarctica as an ice ring. I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on that and show you exactly what I was talking about. Really interesting scene that kind of symbolizes how, programming can shape our belief system is a scene from The Truman Show where he wants to explore, and he's shown a map that says, no, everything's been explored already. And, it's interesting because we all broke free from the years of, globe indoctrination, but that's not just globe indoctrination, it's the two-way street, even with the flat earth side, because with the flat earth side, you first get into it and you're already presented maps and models, and you're told that this is the gospel of flat earth, this is how it works. You're shown the Gleason map, and you're said, you're told that this is how it works. This is the practical map. This is how our model works. And nobody ever really thinks to question outside of that. Like, there's other, options with, the moon map and other ones, but they all generally have a ice ring that surrounds the continent. And it's interesting because if you go back to Alexander Gleason, and you look at like his book, Is the Bible from Heaven? Is the Earth a Globe, from 1892, and he also had the Gleason map that followed the following year in 1893. This is during a time when Antarctica was vastly unknown and unexplored, like 99% of it. The South Pole hadn't been established yet, or no expeditions to the South Pole. It wasn't discovered by Amundsen or Scott. So there was just a few small sections of its coastline that were known, and that was it. 99% of it was the mass size of it was unknown. So he based all of this idea of it being a surrounding ice ring off of a guess, an assumption. And we fast forward 130 years later, and people still take this map that was vastly unknown and basically guessed as fact. And we know with all the expeditions now that that really couldn't be the case. And it's interesting when you look, back to when flat Earth first became big in 2015, we were thrown this map, this Gleason map, and just conveniently it was given to the flat Earth community almost like it was planned, and everybody completely bought into it, and that's kind of been the general accepted map without really thinking outside of possibilities of what if there was something much more simple, that maybe it was just Antarctica was its own separate continent all along, and there's another great barrier ice wall around our world, but people wouldn't really think of it that way because they were presented this evidence. They were told that this is the map that's been hiding in plain sight all this time, when in reality, if it was disinformation and controlled opposition, if the powers that be didn't want us to know the true reality, they would put preemptive measures in place because they expected people would eventually find out the earth is flat. They would put in roadblocks and these preemptive measures in place to prevent you from getting to the full truth. And what better way to do that than giving you an incorrect map to prevent you making any forward progress along the way? And obviously, the Gleason's map has presented a lot of issues and problems. Again, with these Antarctica expeditions, you can't really end up on the east side of South America and then all the way up to the west coast, west over by McMurdo Station, a few thousand miles away in a matter of less than 100 days. That's not logistically and like physically possible. So at some point, when you come across these major problems, you have to have enough intellectual honesty to say, okay, this doesn't work. Let's go back to the drawing board. Let's look at how this could work. Let's look at this without a confirmation bias. And let's look at this objectively, empirically, and let's look where the evidence goes. And that's essentially what I did because, at the end of the day, just like many people, I'm seeking the truth. And I don't want to be following propaganda or misinformation that was possibly planted there. It was put there, whether it's from the Flat Earth Society or the Flat Earth WS debunk website, which is full of misinformation. Whether it's from the cabal, the powers that be, whoever's running the scene. I don't want to follow disinformation. I want to try to filter out propaganda and controlled opposition to try to find what matches our demonstrable reality. And eventually, if you look at it without a confirmation bias and you look for just the truth, and you can have the intellectual honesty to realize that certain things that don't work are going to falsify a certain aspect of a model or map, then you have to make forward progress, and you have to continue to look to where the evidence points you to. And with that being said, let's look at what the evidence has pointed me to, and let's go ahead and take a much closer look at what I'm referring to as the zetetic map of the world. Now, this is what I have named the zetetic map of the world. Spent, a few weeks of designing and laying this out, actually a couple months of doing a lot of the research on the data. And basically, I was actually surprised at how much of the data came together on this. Now, I actually have about like 7 years of drafting and CAD design experience. So I was able to use the resources I had available to scale this as closely to possible, but I was only limited to what I could use on the mapping software. At some point, I'd like to maybe get on Blender and make a more like closer to 90 to 100% pinpoint accurate map. But this is as close as I was able to get with the general layout. Now, what I was basically able to do is triangulate a lot of these measurements from the three gateway cities. Christchurch, New Zealand, Punta Arenas, and Cape Town. Also, get the distance of
or Antarctica from the east to west coast based off of flight logs and distances from the South Pole from other Russian expeditions there. And I was able to basically triangulate a lot of these distances, and it kind of almost it lined up like almost perfectly, like a missing puzzle piece. And I was
After triangulating the general location off of the three gateway city entry points, I was able to then take the distance from flight logs and flight times from the entry points from the east and west coast of Antarctica. Obviously, from Cape Town to Wolfgang Runway, it's about 2,876 miles. Then we have the distance from Sydney to Nelson, New Zealand, which, per the Australian Almanac of Shippers and Importers from 1874, it's about 1,550 miles, which is about 18% further than what the globe model claims on Google Earth. And then I was able to take the distance from the Nelson, New Zealand to Christchurch, New Zealand, which was 257 miles. Then I was able to take that distance from Christchurch to McMurdo Station, which is the usual pickup point for a lot of these expeditions. That is about 2,415 miles. Then this distance from the west coast, east coast of Antarctica, this is based off a lot of flight logs and certain multiple surveys and other discrepancies they came across. I have it at between 5,900 miles and 6,400 miles, plus or minus. I believe on this scale I had it at 6,400 miles, but I'm going to go off the minimum just to show, to kind of prove my point here. If we take this 1,000 miles subtracted from the 5,900 miles from Cape Town to here, this would be 4,900 miles, and then you add the 2,400 miles to Christchurch and then the 1,550 miles. That comes out to about 9,200 miles, which is actually what is called for on multiple sources. So from the Gleason map, the model builder GPS tracking from the southern flights, the southern jet stream speeds, it comes out, it's usually between 9,300 and 9,500 miles. So we can see it's pretty much spot on accurate.
and I was actually surprised at all of the information I found when I actually looked at you know all of these distances, and actually looked at Antarctica as as a continent and tied it into the flat Earth model. Now, with this model, there's speculation as to what's beyond the greater ice wall.
Now, when I say the Great Barrier, I'm actually referring to the greater ice barrier that surrounds all of the known seven continents, including Antarctica. Now, this Great Barrier has been talked about in old historical texts from the likes of his pronouncement by R.J.S. Collimore. It's been spoken about by Captain Wilkes, Roald Amundsen, Captain Cook. They all described this 100 to 150 foot tall wall of ice that for thousands of miles was impenetrable and had no passageways. Now, I believe that's what they're actually referring to, is this greater barrier that surrounds our known Earth realm. Now, what's interesting is about the Antarctica Treaty is I think the main focus on that is not so much Antarctica, but it's the below the 60th degree latitude. If they can restrict us from traveling through millions of square miles of southern oceans, who knows what's actually out there? Could there be a firmament out there? Could there be outer lands? Could it be both? Could there be a Summergate passage that was spoken of in old historical textbooks from the 1800s, like the Iron Republic, that leads to these outer lands? We can only speculate at this point because of the Antarctica Treaty won't allow us to verify what's beyond 60th degree latitude. Now, when we look at some of these old historical voyages, we can kind of get a more accurate idea of what they were talking about when they were speaking of the Great Barrier. For example, we can look at a lot of Captain Cook's old historic voyages, and a lot of times he would get quite a bit off course when he got into the southern oceans, and he would describe seeing this large ice shelf that would be 100 to 150 foot tall, and it would go for thousands of miles, and it was impenetrable, and there was no passageway through it. And I think that's what a lot of old historic, navigators ran into is they would try to dead reckon south from parts of Europe and Hawaii or Australia, and they would, run into this Great Barrier. And that's why a lot of times they'd get off so far of reckoning is because their compasses were always pointing to the magnetic north. And they would get so disoriented and lost in the southern seas. Now, it wasn't until the early 1800s when the Russian navigator Fabian Bellinghausen allegedly was able to circumnavigate the actual continent of Antarctica, and by finding a specific route below South America to go around it and then up to Australia and then back up to South America and back to Europe. Now, that's that's why they had so many issues in the southern oceans, because it was a much larger area than they expected. Now, when it comes to the four quarter Earth theory, I think that that's actually the case too with the Zetetic map, because obviously the Sahara Desert is moving, it's shifting to the west, and then East Antarctica is freezing over while West Antarctica is melting, which would make sense with the sun and it's moving in that direction to where it's going to be going through that great cycle. So I think that also applies with this map. Now, with that being said, let's actually get into some more of this evidence that strongly supports this model, and let's look at some of the old maps. Now, we'll notice on a lot of these older maps, you'll see that Antarctica is obviously a lot wider than what we're typically shown. This map is from Gerard de Jode from 1593. Now, what's really fascinating about this is it's actually saying Arctic and Antarctica on these labels. Well, this is from almost 500 years ago when this was supposedly still the mythical Terra Australis, but yet they're showing it as Antarctica. So I found that incredibly fascinating. Another map we have is from Johann Johannesis. This is from 1616. And again, this is showing Antarctica, the continent, a lot narrower than what we would normally observe it as on modern day maps. And you'll notice this is kind of a recurring theme with a lot of these maps from the 1500s and 1700s. They're actually calling it Antarctica. This one they're calling it Terra Australis, but a lot of them will call it Antarctica. Another one, this is from Philip Bausch. This is from the year 1757. Obviously, you can see this lines up a lot with the way I have it drawn. They have it, the bulge over here, the peninsula would be kind of perpendicular to South America, and then it's wider this way, lines up with Africa. And there's another thing that's really interesting with this one, and I'm actually going to kind of piece it together for you, and it's going to make a lot of sense. But obviously, it shows Antarctica before it was covered in ice, and there's some water in the middle. This is also the same Philip Bausch. You can see here he's showing kind of the polar projection here. There's South America and Australia. They got it obviously a lot longer here. Antarctica is a lot wider in distance. So it's covering a lot more distance going east to west. And you'll see that's kind of common with a lot of these older maps. And that's with the objective evidence I'm going to show you later. It's gonna line all these maps up with the size of Antarctica. And here's another map here. This is from a 1953 issue of National Geographic. You'll notice that Antarctica is a lot wider and longer here. You can't see the full picture, but it's obviously from like over here to way over here. Now, this is actually looks very similar to the map that I have with the Zetetic map. And you can say that it's a like a azimuthal projection, centered on, US, perhaps even Washington, which but that doesn't necessarily actually look like the exact distortion you would see. So I find it really interesting that they're showing this map here. And this is another one, was on the JFK Air Force One. Obviously, you can see there's multiple spots where they're showing the same map, which is very similar to the Zetetic map. They got Antarctica as a much wider continent at the bottom. Obviously, Africa's here, Australia's a little bit wider. So I think that's from the distortion from the polar projection being centered on like Washington, D.C. but it's still kind of interesting because it seems like they could be showing you the truth in plain sight here. Um, what's really interesting is when we start looking at some of these maps and we kind of do a side by side comparison, we kind of notice that that longer length really matches up with the just how the Antarctica looks on the Zetetic map. You'll see here again. This is the Johannes Genesius map from 1616. You'll see it's much longer than it is wider, or it's wider than it is taller. You kind of get that same shape where it's stretched out from east to west, and it's wider east to west than it is north to south. And you'll see on this next map here, you get the same uh, look here, where this is actually the Philip Bausch, and I was able to take, some of you may have seen the azimuthal equidistant. And actually, I think this was just a polar projection here, but you've probably seen this before. It looks a lot like the azimuthal equidistant AE map. If you take his other polar projection and you take the Antarctica from that, you crop it in there, it's almost an exact match to the Zetetic map. And this is from 1717. So there's definitely a lot of maps from the 1500s, 1700s, even the 1950s, back when they actually believed in both the globe and flat Earth, and they taught in schools, and they're showing that map, that Zetetic looking map, in a National Geographic magazine. So it seems like they're kind of showing you a little bit of the truth in plain sight. Um, but now we're going to get into some more of the evidence from historical textbooks that show these distances are much greater than we're told in the South. This is another historical text that I found. This is Zetetic Astronomy from 1881. This is the chapter on the true form and magnitude of the Earth. This text gives a lot of information, a lot of measurements that were claimed at that time from mariners and navigators and explorers from the mid to late 1800s. And there's quite a few measurements they have in here. We're going to briefly go over a few of them. And one of the first ones that I came across was in the Australian Almanac for Shippers and Importers for 1871, page 126. The distance from Auckland, New Zealand to Sydney is given as 1,315 miles nautical measure, which is equal to 1,534 statute miles. At page 118 of the Australian Almanac for 1859, Captain Stokes, HMS Acheron, communicates the latitude of Auckland as 36 degrees 50 minutes south longitude, 174 degrees 50 minutes east latitude of Sydney, 33 degrees 51 minutes south longitude, and 151 degrees 16 minutes east. The difference in longitude or time distance is 23 degrees 34 minutes, calculating in the case of Valencia to Newfoundland. We found that as 23 degrees 34 minutes represents 1,534 statute miles, 360 degrees will give 23,400 statute miles as the circumference of the Earth at the latitude of Sydney, Auckland, and the Cape of Good Hope. Hence, the radius or distance from the center of the north to the above place is, in round numbers, 3,720 statute miles. Calculating in the same way, we find that from Sydney to the Cape of Good Hope is fully 8,600 statute miles. The above calculations received marked corroboration from practical experience of mariners. The author has many times been told by captains of vessels that navigating the southern region, that from Cape Town to Port Jackson in Australia, the distance is not less than 9,000 miles, and from Port Jackson to Cape Horn, 9,500 miles. But as many are not willing to give credit to such statements, the following quotation will be useful and will constitute sufficient evidence of the truth of foregoing calculations. The Great Britain steamer has arrived, having made one of the best voyages homeward from that has yet been effected. 86 days, 72 only of which were employed in steaming, and the remaining 14 days being accounted for by detentions. She left Melbourne on January 6th and arrived in Simon's Bay on February 10th, or 35 days. She then went around to Cape Town, whence she sailed on the 20th of February and afterwards was detained for 4 days at St. Michael's in Vigo. The distance she steamed per log was 14,688 miles, which for 72 days gives an average of 204 miles a day. If we multiply the average rate of sailing by 35 days occupied and running between Melbourne and St. Simon's Bay near the Cape of Good Hope, we find that the distance is 7,140 nautical miles from Melbourne to Sydney, is 6 degrees of longitude further east, or about south fortitude nautical miles. Hence, 7,140 added to 340 gives 7,480 nautical miles, equal to 726 statute miles, which is 126 miles in excess of the distance given on page 94. So there's a few measurements in here, more here. There's, where was the, as for the distance from Melbourne to the Cape of Good Hope is 7,140 nautical miles, as shown by the log of Great Britain. And the whole distance from Melbourne to Liverpool was 14,688 nautical miles. It follows that deducting 7,140 miles from 1468, that the passage from the Cape of Good Hope to Liverpool was 7,548 nautical miles. If we take that distance from 16,000 miles, which the above mentioned yacht sailed to Sydney, we have a distance from between Cape of Good Hope and Sydney, 8,452 nautical miles, or 9,860 statute miles. So there's a lot of these that are kind of basically putting the distance between Port Jackson and Cape Horn, about around 9,000 and 90, like 9,300 and 9,500 miles. And that's kind of what the distance you see there. So obviously it's a lot farther in distance between Australia and South America than what we've been told. Another interesting measurement they have here, and I'm kind of leaving this one for the end. If we take the chord of such an arc, we shall find that the direct distance from Port Phillip to 78 degrees south would be about 9 days sail, or 10 days from Sydney. No ordinary steamer would sail in such latitudes more than 150 statute miles a day. Hence, 10 times 150 would be 1,500 miles, which added to the previously ascertained radius of Sydney would make the total radius of the Earth from the northern center to the farthest known southern circumference to be 5,224 statute miles. Thus, purely practical data, setting all theories aside, it is ascertained that the diameter of the Earth from the Ross Mountains and from the volcanic mountains of which Mount Erebus is the chief to the same radius distance of the opposite side of the northern center is more than 10,400 miles, and the circumference is 52,800 and statute 52,800 statute miles. So that's kind of what they're saying is the circumference of what I'm claiming is the Great Barrier is about 52,800 miles, which is what a lot of people kind of generally claim is somewhere between 50 and 60,000. And now there's one more measurement that I wanted to take from the Australian Almanac of Shippers and Importers, I believe from 1874. And that's going to tie into like the overall measurement, like a lot of the distance discrepancies with Antarctica. So we'll go ahead and go and cover this other measurement here. Here is another measurement from Sydney, Australia to Nelson, New Zealand. Now, this measurement on Google Earth is an assumed distance of 1,310 miles. But if we actually look in the Australian Handbook of Imports and Shippers from 1874, it directly states that this measured distance is 1,550 miles, which is a full 18% longer than what they would claim on the ball Earth. Now, what's interesting about that is that if you take that 18% and you go down to even a further latitude to Antarctica, 60, 70, 80 degrees south, that 18% is now going to come to 35 to 40% more of a difference in the distance. And we're going to find out that that's actually what these distances on these flight logs and surveys, and they all come out to around 35% more, 40% more of what we're told. So it all kind of corroborates this evidence from these historical texts. So let's go ahead and get into some of these flights from the east and west coast of Antarctica.
One of the weird things I noticed was, first, this flight goes from Cape Town, South Africa, down to Witchaway Camp. You'll see down here it says flight to Antarctica 5.5 hours. Then I thought what was weird is down here it says flight to Emperor Penguins 2.5 hours. Okay, that's this little excursion here. But it says flight to South Pole 7 hours each way. So that's interesting that this flight here, 7 hours each way, this flight here is 5.5 hours. Just interesting. And this just does mention that flight extra time that I was talking about, because it talks about, even though it says we stop for 1 hour to refuel and then continue another 2 hours, well, they say here the first part of the journey is a 5-hour flight to refueling stop. So it does fly 5 hours, stop, and then fly 2 more for a total of 7, when the flight, which is much longer, maybe we can check that out real quick. I didn't do that, so let me see. If we go to Google Earth, let's just check that out real quick on the fly. So if we are going from Cape Town, and we're going to be, where's Cape Town? Right there. So they're going to fly to, I didn't really see where they were going, like here-ish. Let me go check that real quick. That map was up here. Okay, so about there. So, and then, so I got 2,500 miles, and then they've got, let's clear that, 2,500 miles, but then from here to the South Pole, 1,300 miles. So you're talking about 1,200 miles further, but you're getting this distance done in 5.5 hours, but you're getting this distance done in 7. Then it just seems very interesting, something to look at. And then it showed a 2.5-hour flight, basically going from here to here, which we've got about 668 miles. So
when we look at this flight, we'll start to notice some pretty major discrepancies. Now, what doesn't really make sense, if they're taking 5.5 hours to navigate, 2,500 miles, but then they're taking another 7 hours to navigate, only 1,200 miles. That doesn't really make sense, because they would be navigating, 2 more hours to navigate 1,200 less miles, which makes no logistical sense. Like, to me, that makes it sound like they're traveling 7 hours from here to the South Pole, because it's maybe 800, 1,000, 1,200 miles further than what they're claiming, because that's why they're traveling 2 hours more. Instead of, it should only be, if we're going off of this being a 5.5-hour flight, this should only be, if this is 1,200 miles less, almost half the distance, this should only be a 3.5-hour flight instead of 7 hours. So it's basically, if you're saying this is, 1,300 miles, then this should actually in reality be closer to 2,500 miles. It's going to be about double the distance. So now, this, obviously we don't have an exact flight log for this. It doesn't really make sense. But we're going to find that we run into this same issue on the opposite side of Antarctica, on the western coast of Antarctica. And we're going to see that this other evidence is actually objective evidence. Like, it's undeniable objective proof that Antarctica is many miles further across than what we're told. So let's go ahead and get into this other flight log evidence, this proof on the other side of Antarctica. Now, this is the other flight log I was referring to. This was a flight, Antarctic expedition that took place in 1987. It's called Our Fantastic Planet. And he's got a book that shows all the flights that he took, the routes. And then at the end of the book, he's got a flight log that lists all of his flight times and his nautical miles and kilometers. Now, he used a Twin Otter plane, which I think is like a Canadian plane. But he knew the exact cruising speed, the max speed of it, and he's got all of his time down to the minute and the exact nautical miles and kilometers he traveled between each station in Antarctica. So what we're going to do is we're going to compare these distances, and we're going to actually add them up, and we're going to get the total kilometers, and we're going to convert it to miles, and we're actually going to compare that on Google Earth, and we're going to see that it completely destroys Google Earth, and it completely falsifies the claimed distance of Antarctica on a globe. So what we're first going to do is we're going to go off of this route that he took from Casey Station to Davis Station, then to Mawson, and then to Kiowa Station. And we're going to add that up, and we're going to add it up on Google Earth, and you're going to see how it's not even close to what they're claiming. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at Casey to Davis, which is 1,464 kilometers, and then we're going to add Davis. We got to skip a few of these because he did a lot of surveys and on the glaciers where he kind of went inland a little bit, but we're just going to take the direct routes. So we have Davis, Casey to Davis, and then we're going to take Davis to Mawson, which is right here, and that is 1,532 kilometers. And then we're actually going to subtract about 20 kilometers because Oster, it's like 10, 12 miles away. So he did that and then backtracked to Mawson. So we're just going to subtract, we'll just say, let's say 20 kilometers. And then lastly, we're going to add the Mawson to the Kiowa and then back to Mawson. Now this one, we actually have to subtract half of it because he went from Mawson to this Russian station, then to Kiowa, and then did a 180 U-turn and then backtracked to Mawson. So we're actually only taking half of this distance because he actually went back to Mawson, so that's the total distance. So instead of 2255, we're going to say, what is that? 11, half of 2255 would be 11, like 27, I guess. So 1127. And we're total for that we're going to have is 4,103 kilometers. Now we can convert that 4,103 to miles. That is about 2,549 miles. We'll just say 2,550, round up. Now we're going to convert this over to Google Earth, and we're going to see how far this is off. So we're going to actually have to, I actually put all the stations in on the station longitude and latitudes. So we're going to add those. Minimize this. So first we're going to have Davis Station, and then we have Casey, Cape Evans, and Kiowa. So Davis is 68.57 south, and then 77.96 east. Enter that. I'm going to save. And then we're going to put another one. We're going to do Casey Station, which would be 66.28 south. And then we're going to do 110 52 east. And then we're going to do Mawson. Where did I have Mawson? I have to figure Mawson really quick here. So Mawson is 67. .6 south and 62.87 east. Save. And then lastly, we're going to do Siwa. And that one is 69.01 south and 39.59 east. Okay, here we go. So we got our 4 base stations. Now Cape Evans is for another route that he took, but we're going to back out. Now we're going to measure this. So we're going to see how far this is off. And it is not even close. I actually even named him by name here. I should have actually, yeah, okay, here we go. So we're gonna kind of, and what he did is he went really close to the coastline, as you can see here. So it's literally following the coastline, and then he goes out to this little point here. So we're gonna follow the identical route that he took. Here, we're gonna measure on the coastline. Here, into Davis, and then he went over to Mawson, and then lastly he went to well, he went to this Russian station over here on the peak, and then he went to Mawson, and that is done. So that measured 2,055 miles, whereas when we calculated it on the kilometers, it actually was 2,549 miles for the exact same route. So we're off by, 500 miles here. Okay, so we're going to look at another quick route here, and this is just 2 spots, so it should be pretty quick. This one is from Cape Evans to Casey, which is from here, Cape Evans right there on the inside of the Ross Ice Shelf, and then he flies directly to Casey. Pretty simple route. Now here he is saying that distance from Casey, from Cape Evans to Casey is 3,005 kilometers. So we're going to look at that here. So 3,005 is approximately 1,867 miles. So we're going to measure that now on Google Earth, and we're going to see what that comes out to. And we got about 1,332 miles from Cape Evans to Casey Station. Straight flight, exactly what he flew. And according to his flight log, he was actually traveling 1,867 miles. So we're talking, almost, 550, 600 miles more than what, Google Earth is saying. So you got one route that's saying, over 500 miles more, and then you have another route that's saying it's almost 600 miles more for this little small section of Antarctica coastline. This here is saying it's, almost, 500 and something miles more from here to here. And then from here to here, it's saying it's almost 600 miles more per his actual flight log. So to me, that is objective proof that completely destroys Google Earth, for one, and it completely falsifies the official claim distance of Antarctica on just this little small section here. We're talking 600 miles. 600 miles, that's the size of like a large U.S. state. There's literally the landmass of an entire U.S. state is like missing on this little section of Antarctica. Like that's how many, you're talking 500-600 miles in just this little sliver of area here. So that's a lot to be off. And then obviously we looked at the other side, the East Coast, and that was off by, almost, 1,200 miles if you do the math. Then you're looking at 1,800, 2,000 miles of difference on the East and West Coast. That's almost over 2,000 miles that they're off. And this here on this East Coast or the West Coast, and that's undeniable proof. You have his flight log right here. It tells you the exact hours and minutes, the exact kilometers that he flew on his Twin Otter airplane. And it's showing that he's, almost 600 miles off in one little section. So it just shows you that there's all these discrepancies with the mileage and the distance on these flights on the west and east coast of Antarctica. We have issues with distances between Australia and South America and Africa to South America, and now we have these massive mileage discrepancies on both the east and west coast, which is completely corroborates the percentage difference from the Australian Shippers and Importers Almanac that shows that was 18% off just in that little section of New Zealand. You go down to 60, 70 degrees south, you're going to be off by 35% on your distance. And that's exactly what his flight log shows, coincidentally. So the math all adds up, and it's undeniable proof that Antarctica is far greater in distance across from east to west. I mean, this is the numbers are right here. It's undeniable objective proof that it's much wider than we're told. It just goes to show you that's how much lies they have in this deception. They're literally hiding thousands of miles of distance on just the coast of Antarctica. And that's not even, all of the discrepancies we have with the distance of Antarctica. Like we'll actually find out here that there's surveys that show Antarctica being thousands of miles of greater distance on just the coastline. So let's go ahead and take a look at one of these surveys.
Hello everyone. I wanted to quickly share something that I saw on the channel DC Force. I'll have a link to the video in the description, but I do not know who originally made the discovery. A big thanks to the person who first discovered and shared it. When you measure around the perimeter of Antarctica on Google Earth, depending on how detailed you would like to be, you get a perimeter of over 11,000 miles. Officially, the distance around the coastline of Antarctica is 11,200 miles. That matches my rough estimate on Google Earth, but this is where it gets interesting. According to the NASA webpage titled New Map of Antarctica's Icy Edge, the international effort called the Antarctic Surface Accumulation and Ice Discharge Project, led by NASA, the team identified a perimeter for Antarctica's ice of roughly 53,610 kilometers or 33,312 miles. The circumference of the Earth around the equator is officially 24,901 miles. That means that NASA says the perimeter around Antarctica's ice is 8,411 miles longer than the distance around the equator. Sorry, but that's impossible under the globe, but certainly fits well with a flat Earth. Thanks for watching.
If we take a closer look at this survey of Antarctica's coastline, we can see that it's not, quite what you think it is. Now, obviously, with Antarctica's coastline, you're going to have a lot of, waves and ins and outs, and you have glaciers, and you're going to have, like the Ross and the Ronnie ice shelves. So they're kind of going in and out. It's they're going to have a lot of different plots of measurement. So it would be expected that it's going to be a little bit bigger. Now, being that much bigger seems a little bit, drastic. I don't think it would be like 33% bigger than what they're claiming the coastline is. But so it's not, obviously, even with this wouldn't be really a big win for the Gleason map, because 33,000 miles, that still wouldn't even cover. That's barely over half of what the Gleason's map diameter was. Like I had showed earlier in that document, they were saying in the diameter of the Great Barrier ice shelf would be about 52,000 miles. So this wouldn't really even cover that. But here's something very interesting that I found out about this survey that to me actually highly suggests that Antarctica's coastlines, particularly its east and west, are actually longer in distance than what we're told. Is that when you compare this map of Antarctica's icy edge, this survey, when you compare it to the British Antarctica survey, their numbers are not even close. Now, this one was from NASA, was published in 2010, January 29 of 2010. The British Antarctica survey, this is a geographical statistics Antarctic fact sheet. This was published in May of 2005, so this is 5 years before the NASA one. And the distance that they have for the total coastline of Antarctica, the survey team have a total distance of 45,317 kilometers, and that's including all the ice shelves and all the nooks and crannies of the coastline. So why is it that they have 45,000 kilometers, which is 28,158 miles, while the Antarctica coastline from NASA's survey is 33,000 miles? If we do the difference here, if we subtract 33,312 miles, and we subtract the difference of 28,158, that is a total difference of 5,154 miles. So how are you off by that many miles? How would you be off by 5,000 miles, over 5,000 miles on two different surveys of the coastline? I mean, is Antarctica's coastline somehow magically growing over 5 years? Doesn't really seem to make sense, especially when they say global warming is actually melting the coastline. But yet, according to this British survey, the British Antarctic survey, and the NASA survey, Antarctica has apparently grown 5,000 miles. So how does that make any sense? Well, the one thing I gather out of this is that it seems to kind of align with Antarctica being a much greater size than we're told, because these two these survey companies can't even make up their mind on what the actual difference is. Now, I can see if they were off by a few hundred miles, but being off by over 5,000 miles just doesn't add up. The math just isn't mathing. So the more I look at these surveys, the more it tells me that with that 5,000 mile difference that NASA was showing, you split that in half, that's 2,500 miles on each side of the coast, and that's a lot of mileage that you'd be adding on to the coast. So obviously, if you look at flight logs and you look at the surveys and you look at the expeditions, all of them show that Antarctica is drastically wider on the coast. Particularly with the flight logs from the Our Fantastic Planet expedition, that objectively proves that Antarctica is, nearly 700 miles longer on just the west coast. And now you have these surveys that have a difference of 5,000 miles. So, you have enough objective proof that Antarctica is drastically greater in distance, undeniable proof that it's much wider from the east coast to the west coast. And we're going to actually be able to corroborate even more of that evidence when we start looking into some of these Antarctica expeditions, and we realize that the distance over math for all of them ends up coming out to more than double the distance than what they should be navigating. Let's go ahead and take a closer look. Now, I wanted to kind of show, just for some context, with these traverses of Antarctica, most of them, not all of them, but a lot of them, they do what's called snow kiting, where they use skis and they have a snow kite. And you can see with the clip on the right there, that's actually a snow kiting race in Ragnarok, Norway. And I think it was like 3 or 3.5 hours long of a video. And if you watch the odometer on the left, it rarely drops below 20 miles per hour for like 3 hours. So he can average a cruising speed of 20 miles per hour or more for several hours at a time, and sometimes he gets up to 40 miles per hour. Now, and to say, well, he's carrying a 500-pound supply sled. Well, this is just an amateur skier on the right in Antarctica carrying a 500-pound supply sled. He's going at least close to 25 to 30 miles per hour there. So obviously, even with the 500-pound supply sled, they can move at a pretty fast clip when they're snow kiting. Now, obviously, the clip on the left is actually Mike Horn on his traverse of Antarctica back in 2017. And you can kind of compare the two side by side. You can see how fast Mike Horn is actually skiing. And he's doing this for about 12 hours a day. That's what he admitted in his social media updates. So you kind of have a pretty good idea of how fast he's actually navigating.
The reason for that is, again, because of these GPS meridian distance corrections. These are the same built-in GPS meridian distance corrections that I had referred to previously in several other videos that were cited in the physics paper, The GPS and the Constant Velocity of Light by physicist Paul Marmot, that was discovered by physicists and GPS engineers decades ago. Now, these GPS meridian distance corrections are built in between the meridian lines to correct for the longer distances below the equator and spherical excess below the equator. And this is why when they navigate all these extra miles, it's only showing that they're, navigating, 2 to 3 miles per hour when they should be navigating, 15 to 20 miles per hour over these long distances, because the GPS is automatically making these corrections in the GPS coordinate system on the ECI reference frame and the atomic clock. It's all built into the synchronization of the GPS coordinate system. So it's always going to correct for the distance that they should be navigating on a globe assumption, when in reality they're navigating much more greater distance, many more thousands of miles than what they're allegedly navigating. So it's all built into the GPS coordinate system. And that is why they're covering much greater distances when they're navigating on these Antarctica expeditions.
And when we look at the Mike Horn expedition, it took him about 57 days to cross Antarctica from Novo Station on the east coast to Dumont Drevai Station on the west coast. Now, if we actually consider the amount of time he was traveling to get an accurate idea, it took him about 4 days to get to the top of the plateau from when he started. And then he took another 2 days off from skiing because of bad weather per his social media updates. So we figured he was navigating about 51 days. Now, if we take the time over distance, he was traveling 12 hours per day per his social media updates. That would be about 51 days times 12 hours per day is 612 hours travel during the experience. Now, if we take that divided by the 300 or 3,168 miles divided by the 612 hours, that comes out to only an average speed of 5.17 miles per hour. Now, to put that in perspective, that's only, the average walking speed is 2.5 to 4 miles per hour. So he's only going a little bit faster than the average walking speed while he's kite skiing for nearly 20 miles per hour for a large part of the trip. So, but if you actually do the math at figured at 10 miles per hour and you take that over 12 hours per day, that's 120 miles per day. It actually comes out to a total of 6,120 miles for the expedition for the entire course. If you figure the actual average cruising speed for any of these people that snow kite. So it's nearly double the distance of what was claimed to travel across Antarctica. And it also lines up with a lot of these other flight log and mileage discrepancies, especially when you take it the fact that at 40 degrees south latitude, it's that 18% increase per the Australian Almanac. This would be about a 40% increase because it's between 79 degrees latitude. So it matches up with all of the other evidence. And another expedition we're going to look at is the Rune Gelnus expedition. Next, we're going to look at the expedition of Rune Gelnus, who actually followed a similar route to Mike Horn. He also started at Novo Station on the east coast of Antarctica and navigated the South Pole and continued to Terra Nova on the west coast of Antarctica. This expedition took him about 93 days and about 2,985 miles. He also navigated for about 10 hours a day. Now, to get a more accurate idea, it did take him about 8 days to get up to the Antarctica plateau. So we're going to subtract those days, and there's also about 4 days 7 days that he didn't navigate per his log. So that would be about 78 days. When we times the 78 days times 10 hours per day, it gives us a total of 780 hours of his total expedition. I'm going to divide this by 2,985 miles by the 780 hours, which gives us an average navigation speed of just 3.82 miles per hour, which again is like on the slow end of the average walking speed. But if we actually figure the math that he's generally navigating while he's kite skiing at least 10 miles per hour, we take that over the course of 10 hours per day, that's 100 miles per day. And then over 78 days, that's about 7,800 miles per day that he'd be navigating on this expedition, which, actually comes up with an even further mileage discrepancy than the Mike Horn expedition. And it's more than double the distance that he should be traveling across Antarctica, which goes to show you that even when you figure a slow speed for kite skiing and you subtract the days they didn't navigate, they're still traveling more than double to triple the distance they should be navigating, which makes really not a lot of logical sense. Now, lastly, we're going to look at the most recent expedition, which is by Ashke Navati, which is actually being done currently right now in Antarctica. Last, we're going to take a look at a more recent expedition, which is the expedition of Akshay Nanavati, who is actually currently traversing Antarctica right now, and you can actually track his expedition live on a GPS tracker. Now, he's claiming that this should take him about 110 days, and the total distance is about 2,700 kilometers or 1,677 miles. Now, he's also claiming to be walking about 12 hours a day. So even if we figure the low walking speed of only 2.5 miles per hour times 12 hours a day, it gives us about 30 miles per day roughly. If we take that time and we take it times 110 days, that comes out to about 3,300 miles, which is more than double the distance across Antarctica from east to west, which again is another expedition that shows you that these distances they are navigating from east to west of Antarctica are drastically further and over double the distance that they're supposed to be navigating compared to the official claimed distance across Antarctica, which again only further collaborates all of the other mountains of evidence from flight logs, surveys, and old historical documents that prove Antarctica is far greater in distance across from its east to west coast. And the other thing that is very interesting about this is you can actually track it. So, you can't really say that he's taking a different route, or he's not in Antarctica, he's in the North Pole, or it's a fake expedition. It's all tracked, and he actually uploads daily audio files and video of where he's at in Antarctica while you track him on GPS. So you can see his route here. He ends up starts on the east side there, and he comes out the west coast. And again, this is over double the distance he's supposed to be navigating when you do the distance over time math. Now, the most interesting thing about this particular expedition, and a lot of them that take that route, is they very conveniently go by the unclaimed land territory in Antarctica, which is really interesting because this unclaimed land territory would, be the perfect way to hide extra land. If, for example, Antarctica is 2 to 3 to 4,000 miles wider across, you would have to cut out a slice of the land for it to actually fit together. Otherwise, it's going to be far too big, especially if you're trying to digitize it onto a Google Earth app. You're not going to be able to put in those extra, few thousand miles onto the unclaimed land territory. So if we already know objectively for a fact that they're hiding 600 to 700 miles on just a small corner of the west coast of Antarctica, and probably another 1,000 to 1,200 miles on the east coast, then who's to say that they're not hiding another 1,000 miles or another, 1,200 miles on this unclaimed land territory, which would make a lot of sense why they're taking double the distance to cross that section of Antarctica on all of these expeditions. So the more you look into the unclaimed land territory from the bigger picture, it all starts to finally make sense, and it makes all the other evidence come together with this greater distance across Antarctica.
It's a lot for a piece of ice floating, as they say it is, a huge. And we have two unclaimed areas here, which makes no sense. Like they claim this area, and why this little area here? Nobody
why
wants.
didn't anyone claim that?
Yeah,
So good luck on getting a pass to go through that unclaimed area.
You can't,
the Antarctic
man.
Treaty. I mean, no one's going to approve that.
It's not area of ocean here that is off limit.
Yeah, and it puts it out of view of any boat as well. So, and that was the point, is that they could have easily defined it to say the land area of Antarctica.
Right.
Or something more easy, but they did it in a way that nobody could actually map it if they wanted to.
Exactly.
You have to be insane or a lying shill to think that there's something that isn't very strange about the Antarctic Treaty and the fact that they closed an entire continent to independent exploration.
Yeah, exactly.
The cover of on your screen right now, Surrendered and Untamed, is a very little known, little dispersed DVD about some fellows that are traveling across Antarctica. They don't actually go across Antarctica the long way. They cross it in a segment, as you're seeing in your screen now, which is what apparently all surveyors of Antarctica follow in roughly these paths. Firstly, it's very, very difficult for me to believe that this video is somehow faked and is not genuine and real. Therefore, if it is, these fellows in this video did in fact cross some sort of continental aspect of Antarctica. The DVD is very little dispersed, as said. Here you will notice on Amazon.com it has a very low sales ranking and only one review, indicating extremely low viewership and popularity, and it's an almost unknown DVD. Of course, it could be faked, but again, that seems almost outlandish to think that would be the case, and it's almost certainly the case that it is real. For the purposes of this video, I will assume from this point that the DVD is real and everything reported in the DVD is fact, and these fellows did cross part of Antarctica. The question then becomes, if the Zetetic plain contains an ice wall, and that's what Antarctica is, in fact not a continent but a wall or rim around the edge of the Zetetic plain in a circular or roughly circular fashion, then how could these fellows have crossed something that resembles a continent and not know that they're not crossing what they think they are crossing, which is Antarctica according to the heliocentric model of planet Earth, which is in fact a Zetetic plain? What is certain is that this will be some sort of a departure from the ice wall model. And from what I can tell, there are two ways that this can happen. If there are more, it's possible that I could have missed it, but these are the only two that I can think of. The first would be that there is a tremendous bulge in part of the ice wall, somewhere centered below Africa, as showing here on your screen. The second model would involve not a bulge, but simply another continent where the bulge and the ice wall would be. And the idea of an ice wall existing would be independent of the topic of this additional continent. There may or may not be an ice wall, and what is called Antarctica would simply be this additional continent located below Africa, as you're seeing on your screen now. Since I have not been to these regions of the Zetetic Earth plane, I do not know which model would be correct, if either. However, I personally prefer the second model of the continent because it goes with the Jerusalem map nicely, and more importantly, it fits with the Zetetic eye gyroscope model, which has absolutely no need for any sort of ice wall of any sorts. Antarctica, and these two models, one is a bulge and ice wall, which is aligned more with the popular notion of flat Earth, which involves the theoretical non-empirical ice wall, and the second involves the idea of an additional continent, both of which will involve a landmass that is crossed below Africa according to the Jerusalem map, according to the theory of the Zetetic eye gyroscope. So let's proceed in discussing how this would happen, which is very simple. In the aforementioned video that is called Surrendered and Untamed, which we are taking as a sort of verification that Antarctica exists and can appear to those walking across it as a continent of some 700 miles or so of travel. They say that they entered the Patriot Hills base camp in the film.
To get out there and test the limits of man and the environment.
That's where they start the trek across Antarctica, and apparently this is roughly the area where it is typically started for anybody to cross, since to my knowledge people tend to be taking more or less the same path when they cross Antarctica. People are going this way, not something like, for example, this way. It appears that in general all so-called Antarctic expeditions take roughly this same path. They generally worked in this area, the path, and then over in this area, which would be perhaps the bulge, if the bulge theory is correct. If the continent theory is correct, such as the Jerusalem map involves, then if a different trajectory was taken and somebody ended up, for example, over here, they would be in a location that virtually and nearly no people have ever been to. They could be the first person setting foot on a certain geographical point on Earth. According to the academic and heliocentric mainstream ideas of Earth and history and science and so forth. Therefore, it is curious that basically the same path is taken by all people. Perhaps this is a path which has been informed to people is the best path to take, and so people follow along and naturally just take it. Otherwise, we are left to believe that virtually no people on Earth, except perhaps a few government officials here and there, can claim to have been in other parts of Antarctica, and therefore virtually nothing is known about it, such as if it is part of an ice wall or part of a continent which is not where it is believed to be on a globe planet, and is situated, for example, where it is placed in the Jerusalem map. I'm sure there are examples of people who have said they have taken very different trajectories than the common paths taken in the map you are seeing here. But the point is, we are talking about an astonishingly small amount of people, if any. There should be vast amounts of Antarctica, according to the standard idea of what Antarctica is, according to the heliocentric model, where literally nobody has ever walked. So astonishingly little is known about Antarctica. It could be very easily faked to be something quite different than what we're told it is by the professional academic, professional science view according to the globe of the heliocentric model. Things could be quite easily covered up due to the fact that such an astonishingly few amount of people have been into the interior and crossing Antarctica, and far, far fewer yet have been to the remotest locations, which is the bulk of the so-called continent that we're discussing here. It is difficult to say that Antarctica doesn't exist, and therefore that is not the position held by Zeticism.com at the moment, given all the records of people seeing it and flying over it. However, it's a very small leap in logic to say that Antarctica is very different than what we're told it is, such as being in accord with the bulge theory or the continent theory according to the Jerusalem map, oriented in the way you are seeing in your screen now. One could travel to and from various places on the coast of Antarctica from the continents and the Earth plane and not have any idea that they're not traveling on a heliocentric ball. Here is an example of an expedition that purports to have gone a very different route, ending up somewhere in this region over here. They were purported to have been returned on a Soviet ship called the Professor Zubov, according to Wikipedia's 1990 International Trans-Antarctic Expedition entry. Notice in that entry right here it says, "No one has ever tried a polar crossing of such length. It is unlikely anyone ever will again." So as was just said a moment ago, virtually nothing is known about parts of Antarctica outside of this common paths region that we've been discussing. Apparently, if the Professor Zubov boat is a government boat, then the return of these people that made this expedition would be in the hands of government, and therefore would be back to the original problem, which is that governments are the ones, an astonishingly few amount of people in governments are the ones who know about these remote parts of Antarctica, and virtually no theoretical or empirical information of any sort exists from them outside of agencies such as NASA and other government agencies. So in summary, the idea of Antarctic expeditions is not in any way problematical for the zetetic model of Earth. And as with so many other things about our world, such as airline flight patterns, the strange oddities about NASA, the oddities about the Antarctic cruises and Arctic airline trips with Antarctica Airlines, the Antarctica sailboat race, all of these things have enormously strange qualities to them, which are unexpected. For example, the Antarctic boat race, only a few people have ever done it. Some of the same people do it every year, and they never get very close to Antarctica. As the geoshifter YouTube channel has pointed out. These Antarctic expeditions also fit in the same pattern, which is that they have all kinds of curious aspects to them. Why the same path taken all the time? I'm sure, of course, there's some reason that people are going to give, such as people falling through the ice or mountains in the way and so forth. But as implied above, how do we know? There's virtually no information on the vast majority of Antarctica other than clandestine government agencies. But to get back to the point, the idea of Antarctic expeditions is in no way problematical for Zeteticism.
One of the things that I find really interesting about the Zetetic map and model is how accurately the 24-hour sun phenomena actually works on this model. Now, there's been a few people. One of them is Joe Hanby, and another one would be Steve Alonso, and Psychedelization, and a couple others have all been working on these different demonstrations with the 24-hour sun. Joe Hanby's done incredible work. He's done dozens of models, physical models and demonstrations, and he's done electronic models, virtual models, CAD models, and obviously these physical models, and they all work basically like we observe. But a lot of what he's demonstrating is on the Gleason's map, and what actually looks most accurate is actually on this zetetic map, because if you notice his finger, that where he's pointing his finger, that parabolic mirrored reverse reflection that's got the anti-rotation is actually centered over the South Pole, between the South Pole and the tip of South America, which on the zetetic model, that's exactly what you would see. So it's a physical demonstration of the actual optics of light and how they work on a curved reflective surface. But let's go ahead and look at a few more demonstrations and get a little bit more accurate idea of how this actually works on the zetetic model.
In this one, you see the same thing. You see I've got north, west, east, and south. Basically, this is looking down. This is the hot spot of the sun. This way would be the North Pole. This is south towards the edge of the dome, east and west. So basically, you're standing here, and this is the sun circling around you on the ground. And when I start to move it, you're going to see sun moving counterclockwise. You can even see the map here. This is the map. The sun's moving counterclockwise. This is another way of showing the same phenomenon that I just showed with looking up at the two-way mirror that I use as a mimic superfluid ceiling. So you still see the same pattern, this southern counterclockwise rotation, apparent counterclockwise rotation. This is north, west, east, and south. This would be where you're standing. That's the sun moving counterclockwise on the ground around you. And you can clearly see it. So that's another way it can work without the superfluid ceiling. All right. So let's go to another one. This is a version that's zoomed in on this little dome here from over here. The camera's over here zoomed in. And what you're seeing is, and you can see these two different reflections. These are on two different sides of the dome, but you're getting that counterclockwise rotation. So counterclockwise, counterclockwise. And that's with me moving the source light around clockwise around the Tropic of Capricorn. We'll play it again just so you can see it. You're getting the counterclockwise rotation. Just fine. Another way of showing that it's possible. So I'm going to keep showing different ways that it's possible. It's possible this way with the superfluid ceiling by looking at it the hot spot on the floor. So let's go to, this is where I've laid the phone inside here on the Gleason's map, facing up to the two-way mirror that I use as my mimic superfluid ceiling. And what you're going to see is, once I start moving the source light, now in this you will see the source light as well. And in our real scenario, I don't think we're ever going to see the source light. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And I'm not going to get into all that right now. We only ever see the apparent sun to all perspectives on Earth. But here we go. So what you're seeing is this counterclockwise rotation. This is it. That's the source. And this is the counterclockwise rotation. Not perfect. But what now it's showing is that it's possible. And I've shown it several different ways now. But you can clearly see this counterclockwise rotation that is happening. So we have Arctic and anti-Arctic. That's where that comes from. Some people say, well, it means bears and no bears. Maybe that's true as well. But I personally think it means because we have this anti-arc, this anti-travel of the luminaries above us. So you can clearly see it there. I've added the superfluid ceiling. This is where the phone is laying in the bottom, looking up at the superfluid ceiling, close to the south. I'm moving the source around Capricorn, and you get this counterclockwise apparent sun, and even the hot spot that follows it as well across the surface. So that's one more way that it works.
And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to move the sun west around center. Now what you see in the mirror looks completely opposite to what you were seeing when the camera was facing up from the northern perspective. So you're seeing what looks like an anti-motion to the motion in the center of the north. And the firmament dome is the answer. Now, how does this happen in every location on Antarctica? Well, no matter what zone you're in, it could be as many as 8. I think it's most likely 6, just because of distance and all that and everything, but it could be 8. If you just create 6 slices, each one of those slices, you would see what appears to be an anti-rotation in each one for every observer simultaneously, and the position would just be relative to their time zone. So it does work inside of the flat Earth model based on the assumptions of a super reflective dome and atmos. I believe there's a superfluid ceiling that aids in that, but even without that, the amount of moisture in the air creates a super reflective atmos on its own. So everything about our realm is reflective and designed to show us our existence, our creation optically.
However, the celestial dome and our visual perspective are the answer to the lights in the sky. As you can see here, you can get, when I move the sun around the Tropic of Capricorn, you can see in the position where the final experiment, which is really just an observation, will take place, you get a counterclockwise 24-hour sun. So this was the reason I had the small glass dome in there to begin with, because we do see this way. Our eyes do create a smaller visual dome inside of the larger dome, and every person has an apparent view to the sun, not an actual physical view of its
exact location. We all have an apparent view to its location, and everybody knows this because at any given time, let's say there's 3 different people standing on this plane watching the sun at different locations. You've got one person watching it rise, one person watching it set, and another person with it directly at apex above them. All 3 people are seeing the same apparent sun in different apparent positions. So we know for a fact the sun has an apparent position, not a physical position to our visual perspective. And the smaller sky dome created by the dome view that our eyes create inside of the celestial dome is what is causing the phenomenon of the apparent counterclockwise sun that far south during their summer solstice, which is our winter solstice here in the north. So that's what's responsible for the apparent 24-hour counterclockwise sun that far south that time of year, is the combination of the celestial dome and our sky dome that our eyes create, our personal perspective, our personal sky dome that our eyes create, giving us an apparent view of the sun. This is the reason for the 24-hour sun. If it happens, this is the reason for it right here. This is why it's happening. Now,
Flat Earth model does predict a 24-hour sun in the South Pole because we know the orbits that the objects take, and you can do the math. It's about 1 degree every 69 miles. That's how I rotate our perspective. And for example, right now up here, you have the Southern Cross, no longer Polaris, but you have your south celestial pole because everything wraps around the dome firmament. And then let me cycle through the days, and you see again how the Southern Cross is now rotating around that south celestial pole. But more importantly, you see how the sun is going to be within our perspective the entire time in the South Pole. With Polaris, how our perspective rotates 1 degree every 69 miles, meaning that if our latitude is negative 80 degrees in Union Glacier, that south celestial pole's pointing straight up, so it's about 10 degrees off-centered, and then we know that we can just subtract like 90 degrees from 23 and it's 67 degrees down. Alternatively, you can do it going upwards, but you know that because the celestial declination is negative 23 degrees, it's going to be about 23 degrees above that middle line we talked about. Your perspective has a middle terminating line. That's why some star trails will be straight if you're at the equator. So then throughout the 24-hour period, without even knowing where the sun actually is, just our perspective alone for a 24-hour period confirms that the sun will be within our perspective. Just using our basic observations. This has nothing to do with astronomical models. It's very, very simple. The sun has a declination of negative 23 degrees. You can confirm that yourself by looking outside straight up and seeing where it physically is. Its latitude is negative 23 degrees. That's all you have to do to confirm that. Then you just have to go look at Polaris. Because we're in the north, I know that the perspective of Polaris is about 1 degree every 69 miles. I live in Belize, so Polaris is the horizon because my life, and you can extrapolate that. So applying the scientific method, this is like an inductive form of logic where we establish laws and we can then use that to make predictions about places that we don't really know about. I've never been to Antarctica, so I don't know, but this is why the math and the science tells us that on our flat Earth, we're going to see a 24-hour sun. Thank you all for listening.
The pathway to the truth follows a long staircase of beliefs. At one point in time, we thought that the spinning globe and the map on the wall of the classroom were the truth. But over time, using our own senses and critical thought and a zetetic approach towards seeking the truth, we eventually discovered that the spinning ball was a lie. We then pursued the next stair of belief, the belief of a flat and stationary reality. We have learned a lot today. We have learned that not all maps are created equal. Some maps may even be put in place to slow our progress from finding the actual truth. What is the true map of our reality? If we set our ego aside and are actually intellectually honest with ourselves, it'll always lead us in the path of the truth. I believe with a lot of the evidence, research, and data that was put forth into this zetetic map of the world, we may be heading towards a direction of truth, or at least opening our minds to a new perspective of reality. If the pieces of the puzzle seem to click and connect together on this map like they did for me, as they did with you, and if it resonated as much with you as it did with me, then please like and share, and let's try to get more eyes on this, because we all have the same goal in mind, and that's seeking the truth. And the more people that have an open mind with a zetetic philosophy towards finding the truth, the closer we will get to discovering the nature of our true reality. Thank you for listening. Please like and share if you liked the video. And as always, have a nice day.